William adjusted the straps of his backpack, the weight settling evenly across his shoulders. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows through the dense canopy of the deep forest. He had been hiking for days, mapping out the untouched wilderness for an upcoming expedition. The forest was beautiful but also unsettling in its vastness and silence. The path ahead was overgrown, barely a trail at all. William pushed forward, brushing aside low-hanging branches and stepping over thick roots. He was deep enough now that any signs of civilization had disappeared entirely. His only companions were the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. Midday approached, and William decided to take a break by a small stream. As he knelt to refill his water bottle, he noticed something peculiar. There, partially submerged in the mud, was a rusted metal object. He pulled it free and examined it closely. It was an old pocket watch, the kind you might find in an antique store. The time had stopped at exactly 3:15. A chill ran down William's spine. How had this watch ended up here, in the middle of nowhere? He pocketed it, deciding it would make for an interesting story once he was back in the town. After a quick meal, he resumed his trek, but he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the watch had brought on. The forest grew denser, the trees taller and more imposing. The light dimmed as the canopy thickened. William checked his map and compass frequently, ensuring he was still on course. As evening fell, he set up camp in a small clearing. The silence was unnerving. Even the usual forest sound seemed muted. That night, as he lay in his tent, he heard it, a faint whispering carried by the wind. It was so soft he thought he might be imagining it. Straining to listen, he could make out fragmented words, but not enough to understand. He unzipped the tent and peered outside. Nothing. Just the darkness and the trees. Sleep was elusive, and he awoke the next morning feeling groggy. He packed up and continued deeper into the forest, determined to finish his task. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. Every so often, he would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, he stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. It wasn't on his map. Curiosity piqued, William approached cautiously. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a musty interior. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that filtered through cracks in the walls. The cabin seemed abandoned, but there were signs of recent occupation: a makeshift bed, a pile of canned food, and a stack of yellowed papers. As he rifled through the papers, he realized they were notes and journal entries. The handwriting was erratic, the words frantic. The entries spoke of strange happenings, of whispers in the night, of a feeling of being followed. The last entry was dated a month ago and ended abruptly with, "They're coming for me." A sense of dread washed over William. He decided to leave the cabin, but as he stepped outside, he froze. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" William called out, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the forest. William's heart pounded as he quickly packed up his things. He needed to get out of this forest and back to safety. The whispering returned, louder now, more insistent. He quickened his pace, his mind racing with questions and fear. As night fell, he realized he was lost. The map and compass seemed useless. Every direction looked the same. Panic set in, and he stumbled through the underbrush, branches clawing at his clothes. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath him, and he tumbled down a steep incline. He landed hard, the wind knocked out of him. As he struggled to stand, he saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. William's heart raced as he struggled to his feet, his eyes locked on the shadowy figures moving towards him. The whispering was louder than ever, a cacophony of voices echoing in his mind. He backed away, searching for an escape, but his path was blocked by the dense forest. "Who are you? What do you want?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The figures didn't respond. They moved closer, their forms becoming more distinct in the dim light. William could see that they were people, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow. They seemed almost spectral, but this couldn't be happening. It had to be a trick of the mind, the forest playing tricks on him. Desperation fueled his movements as he turned and ran, his feet pounding the forest floor. The whispering followed him, relentless. He didn't dare look back, fearing what he might see. The trees closed in around him, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab him. He stumbled again, falling to his knees. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body exhausted. But he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. He pushed himself up and continued, his legs trembling with each step. After what felt like hours, he emerged into a clearing. Moonlight bathed the area, casting eerie shadows on the ground. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its gnarled roots twisting into the earth. At the base of the tree was an old weathered gravestone. William approached cautiously, the whispering fading as he neared the gravestone. He wiped away the dirt and moss covering the inscription, revealing a name, Eleanor Whitfield, 1853 to 1887. His mind raced. Who was Eleanor, and what connection did she have to this place? As he pondered this, he noticed something else, a small leather-bound journal partially buried beside the gravestone. He picked it up and flipped through the pages, the writing matching the frantic scrawl he had seen in the cabin. The journal belonged to Eleanor, detailing her descent into madness. She had lived in the cabin, isolated and tormented by the same whispers that now plagued William. Her final entry was chilling. The forest speaks, and its words drive men to madness. I am its prisoner, but I shall not be its slave. A sudden realization struck him. The forest had a life of its own, a dark consciousness that ensnared those who ventured too deep. The figures he had seen were past victims, their spirits trapped, their minds shattered. William knew he had to leave, but the forest seemed determined to keep him. He looked around, searching for any sign of a path. Then he saw it, a faint trail of light leading away from the clearing. Summoning his remaining strength, he followed it, praying it would lead him to safety. The light guided him through the trees, the whispering growing distant. Hours passed, but he pressed on, driven by the need to escape. Finally, as dawn broke, he stumbled out of the forest and onto a familiar trail. He had made it. Collapsing to the ground, he looked back at the forest, its shadows receding in the morning light. He knew he would never forget the horrors he had encountered, nor the knowledge that the forest's dark presence remained, waiting for its next victim. As he made his way back to civilization, he clutched Eleanor's journal tightly. Her story, and his own, would serve as a warning to others. The deep forest was a place of beauty and terror, and its secrets were not meant to be uncovered. Johnny had always loved the forest. Growing up in a small town nestled on its edge, he spent countless hours exploring its depths, learning its secrets. But there was one part of the forest he had never ventured into, the deep forest. Locals whispered about it, spinning tales of those who went in and never came out. But Johnny, now in his 20s and armed with a sense of adventure, decided it was time to uncover the truth. One crisp autumn morning, Johnny set out. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. He packed lightly, some water, snacks, a flashlight, and his trusty map, though it ended abruptly at the boundary of the deep forest. He took a deep breath and stepped into the unknown. The deeper he went, the denser the trees became, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew cooler and the sounds of wildlife faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Johnny pressed on, following a barely discernible path that seemed to beckon him forward. After hours of walking, he stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, decrepit cabin, its wooden walls covered in moss and vines. Curiosity piqued, Johnny approached. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through broken windows. He called out, but his voice echoed back at him, unanswered. Inside, the cabin was a snapshot of a bygone era. Rusted pots and pans hung from the walls, and a faded rug covered the floor. A single, moth-eaten armchair sat in the corner, facing a fireplace filled with cold ashes. On a table, Johnny found a journal. He opened it, the pages brittle and yellow with age. The handwriting was barely legible, but one entry stood out. October 15th, 1963. Something is watching me. I hear it at night, moving outside. I dare not leave the cabin. If anyone finds this, know that I tried to escape, but it won't let me. It's always there, waiting. Johnny felt a chill run down his spine. He closed the journal and decided it was time to leave. As he stepped outside, he realized the sun was setting. The shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to close in around him. He hurried back towards the path, but found it was no longer there. Panic set in as he realized he was lost. He wandered through the darkening forest, the trees seeming to shift and change around him. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made his heart race. The sense of being watched grew stronger. Johnny tried to remember the way he had come, but found himself going in circles. Just as night fell, he saw a flicker of light through the trees. Desperate, he followed it, stumbling into another clearing. This one was different. In the center stood a tall stone obelisk, covered in strange symbols. The light emanated from its base, a soft, unnatural glow. Johnny approached cautiously, drawn to the light despite the fear gnawing at his gut. As he reached out to touch the obelisk, the light suddenly went out, plunging the clearing into darkness. Johnny heard a low growl behind him and spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the night. The tree stood still, but the feeling of being watched was now overwhelming. He backed away slowly, but something cold and clammy wrapped around his ankle, pulling him to the ground. Johnny struggled, kicking out with his free leg, but the grip on his ankle tightened. He shone his flashlight downward and saw a hand, pale, thin, and impossibly long, emerging from the ground. His heart pounded as he scrambled to break free, finally managing to wrench his foot loose. He stumbled to his feet and sprinted away, branches slashing at his face and arms as he ran. He had no sense of direction, only the urgent need to escape. The forest seemed to close in around him, every shadow and rustle a potential threat. The feeling of being watched grew more intense, almost suffocating in its presence. He could hear footsteps behind him, steady and relentless. Just when he thought he couldn't run any further, Johnny burst into another clearing. This one was dominated by an ancient oak tree, its massive branches reaching out like skeletal arms. At its base, he saw the entrance to a cave. Desperate for shelter, he darted inside, his flashlight beam flickering weakly. The cave was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. Johnny moved deeper inside, hoping to find a place to hide. He stumbled over rocks and roots until he reached a small chamber. Collapsing against the wall, he tried to calm his breathing and listen for any sounds of pursuit. Minutes passed, then hours. The forest outside was silent, the oppressive sense of being watched slowly fading. Johnny allowed himself a moment of relief, thinking he might have lost whatever was following him. But as he sat there, he noticed something carved into the cave walls. More of the strange symbols he had seen on the obelisk. He traced them with his fingers, feeling a strange resonance. Suddenly, he heard a whisper. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but it grew louder, more insistent. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. He followed the sound deeper into the cave, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The passageway narrowed, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, until he emerged into a large cavern. In the center, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight, was a pool of water. The surface was unnaturally still, reflecting the symbols carved into the surrounding rock. Johnny approached the pool, the whispers now a cacophony in his ears. As he gazed into the water, he saw his reflection, but something was wrong. The eyes staring back at him were not his own. They were filled with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. He tried to look away, but found himself unable to move. The reflection's mouth began to move, forming words that echoed in Johnny's mind. "You cannot leave. You are mine now." Panic surged through him, and he fought against the invisible force holding him in place. He felt himself being drawn closer to the water, the surface rippling as if in anticipation. With a final, desperate effort, Johnny broke free and stumbled backward. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. He ran back through the passageway, the sense of urgency propelling him forward. He burst out of the cave and into the forest, the cool night air a shock to his system. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the events of the night a blur of fear and confusion. As he lay there, he vowed never to return to the deep forest. Some mysteries he realized were better left unsolved. Johnny's experience remained with him, a haunting reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the familiar. He never spoke of it, but he knew he had come face to face with something ancient and powerful, something that would forever mark him as one who had ventured too far into the darkness.